Now, is she holy because she's doing what God wants her to do, or is she holy because of what she's doing? And I think you can't make that division. I mean, it's she for her experience, she wouldn't be able to pray unless the God was already permeating her with its love.
The kind of setting and nature of the dialogue, for me anyway, it helps me to um, kind of come to these thoughts and ideas in more imaginative ways or other ways which I might not get out of just reading a kind of colder sort of philosophical discourse.
We've got a depiction of something truly impious, and then Socrates, who seems to be devoting his life because he knows that his life was a gift to serve the divine, right? And serve it in such a way that we know that we have a secret tool, so to speak, of relating to the divine, which is through questioning. Questioning is our perfect/imperfect method for being like the divine itself.
Welcome back to another episode of The Ladder, Journeys in Platonic Mysticism. In this episode, our hosts discuss Plato's Euthyphro and the dilemma that shares its name. The dilemma is one that thrusts the question of divine authority to the fore and requires one to sincerely wrestle with any solution offered and the implications that spawn from it. Do we have good reason to favor one side of the dilemma over the other, or might we reject the dilemma as it is formulated? These are just a few of the many themes and ideas addressed in this episode, so stay tuned, and thank you so much for joining us again.
Okay.
Okay.
So today, as we said, we're going to do something different. We're going to actually have a dialogue about a dialogue, which is Plato's Euthyphro, prototypically deemed a so-called early text. I have reasons to suspect it is not as early as we think, but we can get in to that. The reason why we picked this one is the topic is what is piety, which we thought would relate nicely to the themes that we've been discussing in episodes 1 through 5, which, revolve around the nature of what is the relationship between reason and mysticism, what is the relationship between the intuition and our ideas about what is right and wrong and good and true, and seeing how the way that we get into this text, hopefully we can show that, a philosophy professor who studies ancient history is going to have something very different to say than, say, a artist like Gareth, who works within Barthville and William Blake and worlds of romantics, as well as Professor Greg Shaw, who looks at these texts from the lens of the Neoplatonists, as well as cross-comparative traditions like Tantra. And so I'm hoping that the diversity of the discussion, the ways into Plato, that we can see that that's part of the value of what it means to be Platonic, is that it's not about having the same opinion about what this text says, but it's about the dialogue that ensues from this text, and a dialogue that could be more or less better, that doesn't have to just be, relative, it's everybody's opinion, that we can compete, so to speak, for a better interpretation of the text. And that's part of the joy, the serious game, as as Parmenides would say, in the Parmenides, of what it means to do dialectic and philosophy. And so, yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, thanks, Tony. I guess a immediate question that springs to mind for me, and I'll bring it in from the kind of the sense of the picture, as it were, is how we picture this discussion, because the narrative of the dialogue, Socrates, the figure of the teacher of Socrates, what is about to befall him, as it were, in terms of events which will follow this discussion. And in the vein of what you just said there, I suppose it's how, maybe a dialogue like this, both the themes it covers and also the sort of structure and dramatic form of its kind of presentation, as it were, in and of itself raises certain kinds of questions, doesn't it, about whether, let's say, piety is kind of demonstrated, observed, as it were. Is it kind of describable? Is
Mhm.
there a set of uh, instructions on how to be pious, or is it something that's somehow more tacitly known in a sense, or um, and these, of course, are part of the nature of what Socrates, through the kind of method of dialectic, as it were, seeks to get out of his interlocutor, insofar as he appears to know or be confident that he knows at the start what piety is, but then
Let me,
is kind of perturbed, as it were, in his view, and unsettled from it
yeah. So
in the
let me
course of
give
the
a quick
discussion.
summary of what happens in this dialogue.
Yeah.
That way we can have a kind of like arch that we can keep leaning on. So basically, as Gareth was insinuating, in this dialogue, we have Socrates run in to Euthyphro, a kind of whimsical type individual who is actually at the courts in the same way that Socrates is, to make an accusation against his father, as we find out. And Socrates is there because he's being accused by Miletus, a young, a crooked nose, effeminate, according to Socrates, young man who thinks he knows what is good for the young. And so he's charging Socrates with corrupting the youth, right? And so Socrates is there is to address the charge, right? That he's been impious and he has corrupted the youth. And Euthyphro is a kind of Platonic, in a sense, mystic or some kind of mystic who thinks, or Orphic mystic perhaps, who thinks he knows what piety is. And Socrates is like, yeah, please give me that wisdom in that kind of ironic way that he does, so that I can tell Miletus, I erred, now I know what piety is, and now I can go on my way. And thus ensues the typical Socratic elenkos, right, which is this method of refutation, to where he has Euthyphro respond to the question, what is piety? And Euthyphro gives the first answer, which is what I'm doing right now, prosecuting my father. So he's prosecuting his father because his father put one of his workers in a hole to be left there until a magistrate could come and discern whether or not that worker had done something unjust by murdering an enslaved person that was working for them when he was drunk. And that worker ended up dying in that hole. And so Euthyphro thinks his father has committed a crime and has murdered the household worker. And so Socrates is kind of aghast, like, really? You're putting this person on trial for that? But okay, long of the short of it is that Socrates basically parlays against Euthyphro that he wants not just one instance of justice, but give me something broader, something that captures all instances of piety, excuse me. And that leads Euthyphro to argue that piety is what the gods love. And then Socrates parlays, well, the gods sometimes fight about what they like. And that leads Euthyphro to be like, well, it's what all the gods love. And this leads to what is typically called the Euthyphro dilemma, where we have to figure out, well, do the gods love piety because it is pious? Or do the gods love it and so it is pious, right? So here's the difference between the authority of what's right and wrong. Do they just say what's right and wrong and then therein it is right and wrong? Or is there such a thing as right and wrong that condition that the gods or the magistrate or the person in charge says that that is right and wrong, or believes that is right and wrong, because there's a form, so to speak, conditioning why they believe what they believe, or they just believe what they believe. And so here we have a kind of interesting juxtaposition between somebody like Euthyphro, who, you know, gets to act as a medium to this whimsical divine. The divine are always changing their opinions, and so human beings need, in fact, people like Euthyphro to be mediums for divine will. Versus somebody like Socrates, who's kind of showing that no, there's a reason. Gods love something that is real. And so what we need is philosophy, or rationality to be able to look to what the gods are looking to, love what the gods love. Long and the short of it, eventually that leads to another refutation, and Euthyphro advances another definition that piety is a form of justice, and then a form of justice that is divided in between the justice of men and the justice of men towards the divine. And that ultimately leads again to the second or third definition, which was piety is what the God loves. And Euthyphro is kind of annoyed by all this, and so he quickly rushes off and says, "Bye, Socrates," and the dialogue ends in what is typically called aporia, or perplexity, where seemingly no answer has been given. I argue that the answer is, as Gareth insinuated, in the performance, in the showing of the dialogue itself, that's why it's in dialogue form, so that we could see it in a real life situation, in a context where Socrates is embodying in his very activity of constantly questioning and examining our knowledge, the very thing that the God loves. And so we show our devotion, our piety in the act of philosophy. Okay, I just wanted to set that up so that for those people who haven't read the dialogue, they have some basic idea of what happened. And so.
Wow.
Thanks.
Thank you, Danny. Yeah, I think you summed it up rather well. What you didn't touch on was how irritating I found Socrates to be in this. I feel like, what can I say? I was a little disappointed that I thought he was such a jerk in the way that he approached this, and he seemed he seemed to want to portray the entire relationship with the gods as what we used to call in religious studies a do ut des kind of thing. We give the gods something and then they give us something, a transactional way of imagining our relationship with the gods. And that, he wants to put Euthyphro into the box of thinking that piety is offering up the gods whatever it is they want, and then they'll give us something. And I think that that's really not necessarily that helpful of a model to understand the relationship with the gods. That it's not we give them something so that they'll give us something, and then we figure out what piety is based on that sort of framework. I think he puts the framework up there so that within that framework you can never figure out what piety is, and so it's an impossible sort of framework to work with. And Euthyphro at one point says, "Well, I don't really know how to explain it to you, Socrates." And I was thinking, yeah, no way you could explain it to Socrates if he's going to look at it within that framework, because that's not the right framework. It's not a we give the gods something, they give us something. And I was a little bit surprised, unless it's just purely a kind of an intellectual play or game that Plato's doing here, why he would have that be the framework that Socrates wants to impose on Euthyphro.
It's so funny because I don't see that framework at all in Socrates. I see it more in Euthyphro, right? So that we think about the opening where Euthyphro he thinks he has special access into what the gods want. And the gods want him to be like Kronos and Zeus, willing to murder the father in the name of justice, right? To destroy and do the same, to mimic these ancient texts without really thinking about the riddling or enigmatic nature of these myths and ideas. He's just going straight for the literalist approach and then believing he has some sort of special access into what needs to be exchanged, where Socrates kind of he doesn't in a rude way knock this belief, be like, "Are you a crazy person?" No, he's like, "All right, let's see if we can actually, if you know what piety is, if you're so confident, then please, let me know, tell me what it is," and that ultimately trying to expose that look, he's about to be on trial for impiety, Socrates is, and then Euthyphro thinks he's doing the pious thing. And lo and behold, Socrates is going to be the one that's going to be found guilty for impiety. And Euthyphro is just going to go on his merry way. And what I see here is this juxtaposition between the kind of mystic who thinks they know, right, and doesn't need to examine their knowledge. They just work from their gut and then do impious things, versus somebody who has that kind of intuitive relationship with the divine, loves the divine, wants to do what the divine would be set on the human being and the human condition, and tries to do that work even up until the moment that they die.
Right, right.
So
But you
anyways,
started off by saying that do ut des, or we give to the gods so they give to us, is not what Socrates is saying. But it's precisely what Socrates is saying. It's at in the text, where is it at 14c, that Socrates says, sacrifice then is making a donation to the gods,
mhm,
giving them something, while prayer
mhm,
is requesting something from them. We're
mhm.
giving them something and we're asking them to give us something.
Yeah, but
Um,
then he's using
and,
that as
and,
part of the
and,
refutation.
and then later in E, he says, then holiness would be a kind of skill in trading between the gods and men.
Mm.
It's a transaction,
Mhm.
and a trading skill. Well,
And,
that's the
and and
framework in which Socrates is placing this whole notion of piety, that it's a transaction with the gods. And
so
I don't think you can possibly figure out what piety is if you work within that framework.
yeah, but see here he's ironically jabbing at Euthyphro, right? You believe it's a transacting or asking, right? You believe it's a petitioning. And so he's trying to say, look, he's suggesting this, these are the consequences of your belief, right? That if you say that piety is a form of justice, and then it's a form of this with regards to devotion to the gods, he then appeals to common things that people think are pious, like prayer or giving grain or whatever little statue. These are common conceptions of what people think is a pious thing to do, and he's advancing it. And then he gives the line, it's a service to the god, which is a line
Yeah.
that comes from the Apology too, where he says, I go around asking questions as a service to Apollo, right? To show people their
But
importance
okay,
of getting
so
their ignorance.
but you're going on further than where we were focused.
Sorry.
What you're suggesting is that Socrates doesn't mean what he's saying, that he's characterizing what Euthyphro thinks, and
Hmm.
that those really aren't Socrates' sentiments. That
Hmm.
Socrates, in fact, does not think it's a transaction with the gods, but he thinks that Euthyphro thinks that, and he's characterizing Euthyphro's understanding of piety within that framework, which is not the framework that Socrates has.
I would argue yes, right? I think that is exactly what I'm trying to say,
Hmm.
to where, it's a ironic characterization of Euthyphro, and that Euthyphro is kind of, this is one of the reasons why Euthyphro gets annoyed, is because he's kind of been entrapped or ensnared into, contradiction. But also, this is the irony of Plato, the Platonic irony, as opposed to the Socratic irony, where we actually see that the common way that we understand things like prayer and petition and service are transformed through philosophy as something deeper, right? So that the service, gods don't want a transaction. They don't want a back and forth. They want us to become like, right? That when we give to the gods, we become like what they did. They gave us life. When we give
Right, right,
our
right.
lives to philosophy,
Yeah,
yeah, and so, yeah.
yeah, I
Can I?
understand that.
Yeah.
That makes sense to me, but it's being characterized as a transaction.
Mhm.
And Socrates doesn't ever challenge the transactional structure that he is mirroring, you could say,
Mhm.
to Euthyphro. And maybe I'm
Can I
not
say?
being fair to Socrates, but it seems that that's where he's leaving it. Go ahead, Garrett. Sorry.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's an important point, Greg, isn't it? And I think when you there's kind of a response I had to the dialogue as well, in a sense, was just thinking about how Socrates is his line of questioning, the way he kind of sets traps, as it were, which are intended to kind of open up, um, uh, confusions and so on. And but one of the other strategies or natures of the dialogue, I suppose, and this is partly obviously historical and contextual in the kind of polytheistic sense, but which anticipates, I suppose, later Christian debates around this dilemma, as concern, whether or not what God wills is what we must do, insofar as that is good, whatever that may be, or whether God appeals to a standard outside of himself, as it were, and therefore is no longer omnipotent and the sole source of the good, and so on and so forth. But this is a question out of curiosity, in a sense, for both of you, in a way, because I'm interested in one of the problems that I guess Socrates puts Euthyphro in is because the gods are in discord. Uh, we're left with a challenge as to, well, we might sort of, I don't know, please one of them, but then not the other one. And maybe tomorrow he's actually not going to be happy with what I did yesterday, and he's going to change his mind again, and so on. So yeah, he sets up this problem about, to what is my piety directed, if that in and of itself is changeable. Um, and I guess I was interested in this because we have ideas like justice, like virtue, like the good, like beauty in the Platonic tradition, which are these archetypal forms or ideas, um, and of course are the subject of other Platonic dialogues. So I guess in a way, my interest is in why the question isn't directed to that, as opposed to the gods as a multiplicity of beings, of a certain class of beings, if you like, um, and what difference that might make. Um, uh, but also, I suppose, to the idea, which again is taken up in Christian theology, I suppose, that our relation to the good is also a kind of personal relationship. So it's a relationship to a being. So the two things are kind of connected. Whereas in this instance, piety, as it were, or the good, let's say, and the gods are disconnected in some way. I don't know, or at least in the sense in Socrates' portrayal, which gives Euthyphro all kinds of problems.
Yeah, that's
So yeah, this is a kind of question I'm very interested in, as to this historical Platonism, as it were.
every year that I teach the Euthyphro, that is always the solution of Christian students, which is, well, why can't the good or the pious and God be one and the same, right? Like that is their immediate solution. Like this doesn't seem like a real problem or a real dilemma, and so just know like that. Like I've watched it happen every year, where that's the first pipe in solution, as if it's never been had before. I think it's
Well,
it's
like you said, I mean,
wonderfully intuitive.
it's a salute. Aquinas offers such an argument, and yeah.
And the
Okay,
thing is,
tell us, how does this not fit then, Danny, when you have students say this, as Gareth, brought it up? What's your response to that?
oh, it depends on how the conversation has gone before. I mean, there are two streamlines that I kind of tend to talk about. I do focus on the Euthyphro dilemma, as Gareth was saying, but I also focus on the other part of what Gareth was saying, which is a lot of students, they think that what Socrates has done when he goes from that somehow this argument only relates to pagan belief, to people who have polytheistic beliefs. That the big problem is that the gods disagree, and all right, well, there's the kind of contradiction within paganism, that you can never really have a faith based upon a polytheist worldview, because they can contradict each other, and then you can never really know who likes what and when. And I
And
always,
there's some truth to that. I mean,
yeah,
there's a difference too.
this
The
is why I
polytheism
always
creates a
focus.
difference.
No, 100%, like 100%
Yeah, that's
agree.
why I asked the question.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I always remember, or I always try to remind them, but that's the point of the definition 3, that once it becomes all the gods, that it doesn't matter if you are a pagan or a monotheist or a henotheist, you're saying one, right? The all equals a one, right? So that we're making it either a unified belief amongst various different gods, or just one God with one, you know, idea, right? And so that you have to see that the move from refutation 2 to refutation 3 is a move to say this dilemma applies not just to paganism, but also to monotheism.
Well, help us. You're referring to refutation 2 and refutation 3, but you haven't spelled out what those refutations are,
Okay,
so I'm not
so
sure what you're
the
referring to.
I'm sorry, yeah, I should be better about having the line numbers right on my fingertips. But so the first definition that Euthyphro gives is that piety, or the second one technically, piety is what the gods love, and then
Love,
that's
yes.
refuted on the basis of their disagreement. And so Euthyphro advances another one, which is piety is what all the gods love,
Okay, thank
and
you.
then
Right, that
and
clarifies what
that's
you mean.
that's the definition that leads to the Euthyphro dilemma. And
I
so,
suppose the difference is that would,
Thank you.
no, no,
yeah.
no.
But it still leaves. So if you look at the way in which, uh, and I'm not a Christian apologist or theologian, by the way. So these are, amateur reflections. But I think if you look at the way that the dilemma has been approached in the Christian tradition, as far as I understand it, it's that God is just goodness. God is, simplicity, the one, as it were. So there isn't God and the good, uh, in the sense in which we're saying all these gods love piety. We're saying piety is in their essence. Is that kind of what you're
Yeah.
saying, Danny? So it appeals. So in a sense, it's closer to the kind of Christian um, uh, overcoming of the dilemma, as it were.
So yes and no, right?
Yeah.
Because so here's the example I give, and I'm sorry if it's stupid, but I like to appeal to baseball, right? I say, look, when the umpire says that the baseball player is out, is it because there actually is a form of outness, right? That he's thinking of, and he's calling out, or is it just because the umpire says so? And as any baseball watching person will know, sometimes the umpire just says so, and you're like, come on, man, like that's wrong, right? And so that here we can see that there's partly problems in both ways of understanding this, right? If there's a
The
form of
umpire is not purely good, though, is he, necessarily?
exactly. So the
Right.
God,
Yeah,
though,
the
Whereas the
umpire is
God,
not a god.
yeah.
It's not the
yeah, the
god.
umpire's not,
Right.
yeah. I mean, I see the analogy, but it's not, he is, okay. No, I'll let you run with it. Okay.
No, but this is why I love the Neoplatonists, like, because this is the point, is that when we get to the end, right, where piety becomes what the gods love, right, or what a god would have the omnipotent ability to look at it, know it, embrace it, see it, be it. It's absolute. Whereas the human being, if we're going to perform this service to the god and look at the god, what the gods love, or direct their attention to, it's going to be imperfect. That's why we have to infinitely be asking and performing this service, this likeness to the gods, so that here it's not like the divine, like what constitutes the divine of the god, so that the god can't help but be looking at it or directing their attention to it, is something they do absolutely. So I want to say
Yeah.
it's a both and, right? That we want to reserve that je ne sais quoi, that ineffability, a little bit outside, so that even though God is directed to it versus being perfectly
Directed to
identical with it.
what? God is
Directed
directed
to
to
what?
what?
Yeah. I mean,
Yeah, so I would
What are you
say
referring to?
I would say when we're getting to the higher idea, right? So that when it comes to like forms like piety, beauty, justice, like all the gods are looking to those things, right? Identical in that direct relationship with it. But if you think about the Neoplatonic one, right, it is also still the object of desire of the divine, right? It is the ineffable, but they do it like phanes, like all the level of the intellect. Absolutely, this is being. This is what.
yeah. I
I'll
mean, I
shut up.
suppose
I'm taking over too much.
A Christian wouldn't agree with that insofar as it would mean that God looks to a higher principle than himself, and so therefore, I mean,
But doesn't Christ look to the Father?
well, but they are
There
coexistent,
you go.
aren't they? Divided, but
But Christ does look to the
one.
Father.
You have the idea, I suppose. Well, it differs in Orthodox and kind of Latin Christianity in the sense that there's an emphasis on the the kind of essence of the three persons of the Trinity in the Latin tradition, and there's more of an emphasis on the distinction between God's essence and God's energies in the Orthodox tradition, and on this idea of the monarchy of the Father, as you like, is the expression that's taken from Callistos, where the Metropolitan you discusses this idea. Um, so and all are in the beginning and all are coexistent, which is, obviously very disagreeable to lots of people in different ways, but that's the mystery of the Trinity. But I suppose, yeah, I'm just sort of getting to this around this idea of to what extent the gods look to another principle, because that doesn't overcome the dilemma, which is, I guess, what the Christian response through Aquinas, through others, attempts to do. You might disagree with whether or not it succeeds, but I suppose that's the attempt.
Let me understand, what is it that's being attempted here, Gareth?
Well, to overcome the dilemma of whether or not God looks to a standard outside of himself, or the gods look to a standard outside of themselves. And if they do, then I guess in a sense the problem passes on to that higher principle,
So who raises
in
this
some kind of
question?
regret.
What is this question being raised in this particular dialogue, do you think?
Well, I think it is. I think it's being raised by the nature of the dilemma itself, because it's to do, I suppose, with the way in which, uh, well, are we free by being pious, in which case we're just doing whatever God says we have to do, or in being pious, do we become free because somehow we're discovering a good, which is also something that God looks to? But that cleaves the two apart in some
And
way.
that's the difference between an authoritative God or a rational God. And so that's the dilemma, is do we have to choose between those two?
I find this to be almost a caricature of what life is, and that it somehow doesn't seem authentic. The question, it's right there in 10. Is the holy approved by the gods because it's holy, or is it holy because it's approved by the gods?
Mm-hmm.
That seems to be the question we're asking.
Yeah, yeah.
And if it's holy because it's approved by the gods, then that would be your authoritative model. And if it's holy, if it's approved by the gods because it's holy, that would be the rational model.
Mm-hmm.
And I think dividing it as if it's one or the other is a false division. I
Mm-hmm.
don't think it's ever an either or, not in terms of real life. That take a little old woman who is a devout Catholic, and she goes to put her candle up, and she's going to the church to pray, and she's just saturated with a kind of piety, and she's serving what she understands to be the God. Now, is she holy because she's doing what God wants her to do, or is she holy because of what she's doing? And I think you can't make that division. I mean, for her experience, she wouldn't be able to pray unless the God was already permeating her with its love.
Mm-hmm.
And her acting out this prayer makes her lovable.
Mm-hmm.
So that
Mm.
I don't know where you stop one and begin the other. I think that they're inextricably intertwined.
And I,
And
I would
so,
You're absolutely
argue
right.
yeah,
And I would argue Socrates embodies that same old woman, right? That here, he himself is saturated with the fact that this questioning is the ritual, so that philosophizing is the ritual. I'm giving this, I'm doing this. And unfortunately, this particular ritual is not like a candle. It actually causes other people to feel, like they need to be questioning what their rituals are. Like
okay,
Euthyphro's
right.
very activity of thinking he's mirroring the gods and persecuting his father.
So
So,
Socrates' service to the god, like the little old lady with the candle, is engaging in dialectic and questioning. That's
mhm,
his way of serving the god, right?
mhm.
That's what
And
you're saying.
then showing that even if there is an important irrational element to faith, that there is also a rational element to faith, that it can't just be both, not just one or the other, but that belong together. At least that's what I would argue.
You're right. It's not one or
Reason
the
and
other.
revelation.
It's
Yeah.
both. But his being engaging people in this rational sort of elenkos is his way of being pious.
It's
Socrates'
his
way of being
ritual.
pious.
It's his
Yeah,
prayer.
Mm.
Yeah.
it's his service.
Mhm.
Um,
It's
so
his asking. So
So,
there.
yeah, I mean, so I wanted to ask a sort of different way of looking at it as well, and I think this is just picking up again on Greg's point earlier about the idea of transaction. You know, what do the gods want, and what will I get in return, and so on. This sort of idea. Um, I guess there's an idea, I suppose, in Christian theology of it being a gift,
Mm-hmm.
something kind of given, and then uh, if you choose to kind of use it, or you like it, or whatever, then maybe you give back, or do something like that. There's a different kind of relationship to a more kind of fungible one, if you like, as a kind of exchange. There's something kind of mutually uh, uh, complementary about it, or something like this. Um, and whether, I suppose, another perspective perhaps that comes out of Christianity is whether what God gives, or the good gives, is unconditional in a
Mm.
sense. So does it have to be conditional? And what does that
so
mean? It opens up other implications.
so in the case of Socrates, when he is doing his service to the god, I call it just God in general, by engaging in this elenkos and questioning, he doesn't expect to get something in return. It's not a transactional
Yeah.
behavior and I think that what we might see, at least what I'm now beginning to see in a different way, is that this is a critique of Euthyphro's poor conception of what piety is and how best to
Hmm.
serve the god. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
to begin with, the dude thinking that it's pious to take his dad to court for allowing this guy to die in the ditch who was a murderer is nuts on the face of it, and I wouldn't even have spent 5 minutes talking to this guy. But Socrates goes ahead and, engages him. But I think, maybe there are some good qualities of Euthyphro, and so he wants to give him the benefit of the doubt. But also in doing this, it seems that Euthyphro's conception of how you serve the god is not a very deep one
Mm-hmm.
and not a very intelligent one. And that rather than splitting rational and authoritative, in order to really get at the authority of the god, you need to be rational.
Mm-hmm.
And in order to really be rational, you need to engage the authority of the God that allows you to discover what's rational. You
Yeah,
can't take one or the other. They're both necessary, it seems to me.
absolutely. Yeah.
That's a great point, Greg. Yeah, and allow me again just to quote something from Orthodox Christianity here, which is again, this is from Bishop Callistos, where the grace of God invites all but compels none. So this sense that there's a sort of willing, as it were, and a term synergeia, a kind of synergy, a kind of
Mhm, mhm.
Mhm.
cooperation,
Yeah. And this is
kind of
this is
working
why
together.
I think is to go back to your idea of the gift, right? Like Euthyphro has been given the gift of life because of his father, right? Like he's not questioning, as Greg was saying. He's taking it dogmatically, right? That he mirrors the gods in the theogony or the Orphic literature, and that means he's doing right. He can just slap the face of the giver, of the father, and just go on his own merry little way. And that's what I find to be so interesting, is that we've got a depiction of something truly impious, and then Socrates, who seems to be devoting his life because he knows that his life was a gift to serve the divine, right? And serve it in such a way that we know that we have a secret tool, so to speak, of relating to the divine, which is through questioning. Questioning is our perfect slash imperfect method for being like the divine itself. I'm trying to give you
Yeah, it's also something about this kind of fascinating idea about being, uh, let's say, created by the gods, but having some kind of free will or choice by which perhaps there's not one road to being pious. And there's a sense we can discover those paths in different ways. I mean, I guess, we could open this up just very briefly here to this broader conversation we began with right at the beginning about how we understand, pluralistically or syncretically different approaches to uh, that kind of road to the divine in different senses.
Mhm.
I like the fact you picked up on that detail as well, Danny, with the father there, because of course it's something I'd thought of, and a note I'd written down in my preparation for this was thinking about this idea of the gift, but also, the gift of life and having a child, and you know, all of the kind of complications that come with, on the one hand, loving them unconditionally and kind of not wanting anything from them, but also wanting their love and so on and so forth. But it points to it again, just the interest in doing philosophy this way, and in the form of the dialogue, for instance, that differs from, propositional kinds of forms of philosophy, or things which set out arguments in different kinds of ways, because here we're kind of feeling our way around details and things which might seem incidental, but then suddenly reframe the picture slightly. Or it's kind of like looking at a film and there's a character in the background, and actually, maybe they pull our attention to some important part in the plot that we didn't realize was important or something. The kind of setting and nature of the dialogue, for me anyway, it helps me to um kind of come to these thoughts and ideas in more imaginative ways, or other ways which I might not get out of just reading a kind of colder sort of philosophical discourse, if you
No,
like.
100%. I mean, this is why I think Plato wrote in dramatic form, is so that we could always, so that I can go back and read it tomorrow, even though I've read it 1,000 times, and learn something new or see a different detail that I had passed over. So, I mean, it opens with Socrates kind of being annoyed with a young kid, right, who is charging him with being impious, and he's making fun of him for having this conceit, that he knows what piety is, in a subtle kind of way, so that we also have this other young person who's accusing Socrates of impiety in order to gain his own reputation, but also under the guise that he cares for the young, so that we have all these images of people like politicians who pretend to care for the young. And then really, what does Socrates do? This, through this service, he's inspiring other young people to practice the art of elenkos and refutation that the politicians think is problematic or heretical, so that we can understand that why he's being charged with impiety. He's actually giving people the gifts, so to speak, to undermine all of these authorities who rest on their dogmatic laurels, right? And are really just doing it for the sake of looking like they're pious, appearing
Yeah,
pious. And so,
yeah, and it's about the directedness of the good, in a sense, isn't it? I think we touched on this once or twice. I mean, I think you might have mentioned a while back this idea of the absence of the good being evil or bad, as it were. And in this instance, you're talking about the example of someone who kind of, indicts, as it were, Socrates, but under false aims or something like this, but is kind of good at being bad, if you
yeah.
like. So it's the kind of the directedness of that goodness towards something else. And I guess this raises questions that the dialogue maybe then goes on to filter out into other debates around, things like morality or other kinds of areas where, where do we get our measure of the good from, and all the rest of it. But yeah, I think it does raise that interesting kind of problem with these characters about what each of their aims and intentions are, uh, as far as the directedness of the good
Mhm.
is
So,
concerned.
um, if I don't know if I'm like coming in kind of like off key or out of sync here, but I'm back to this question of, I have two questions really. One is the rational versus the authoritative. And it seems that basically Euthyphro claims to be behaving in an authoritative way by using bad rationality, that his rationality is really lame and that he's not thinking this through in any kind of, I mean, if he is thinking that it's some sort of transactional thing and that he's serving the god and it's going to, I mean, his thinking is just lame. And Socrates is trying to help him out on that, I think. But the second question I have, and it's one that we kind of glossed over and moved from the many gods to just all as a group, almost too easily, because the question about the gods having squabbles with themselves, and you've got the gods as these, infinitely powerful beings with great authority, and yet they are having disputes with one another. It anthropomorphizes them, to
Mm,
me, in my mind, that really makes it kind of untenable in this sort of thinking. At least it does to me. And that's why I think the Neoplatonists need to sort of deliteralize these squabbles as talking and explaining them or imagining them as dynamics of a kind of energetic sort of unfolding
mm,
rather than as actually personal squabbles
mhm.
that they're having with one another. But this notion of pluralism of many gods. What does it mean, piety, when, and I'm sure that some people who are putting up a prayer to Aphrodite or putting up a prayer to Hephaestus or something, it's to that particular god. And yet they got the legends and stories about the fight and dispute between Hephaestus and, say, Ares and Aphrodite and all of the problems. And I kind of don't mind that there are squabbles because the messiness of the gods seems to mirror in some way more authentically the messiness of human existence than does this perfect, celibate dude who came out of his dad and his mother who's a virgin and all that stuff that never ever could happen. And so it doesn't reflect who we are as human beings, where the gods are all messed up and they're nasty and they make fun of each other and they're vindictive to each other, just like we are. And
Mhm.
yet they're gods. And so maybe raising this question is sort of like doesn't belong in this discussion,
Of course it
but
does.
I can't help but think about it because what do we do with the fact that the gods are having fights with each other? And how does that fit in to a notion of being a pious person?
I love it.
Uh, it is challenging, I think, and it requires a little bit. The Neoplatonists deliteralize the gods, and so that's how they solve the problem. But I think that's almost too easy.
Mhm.
Um, but you've thought about, you've written about this, Danny, because you've written a lot about how uh, different deities really don't stand for the literal understanding of that, but a kind of a metaphysical principle.
Mhm.
And that's one way to do it. But how have you wrestled with this dilemma that I'm kind of raising here? And I don't know if
So
it relates to anything you've been talking about,
I
Gareth.
think it's one of the reasons why we're all here in this Zoom room, right? Is because here, look at the diversity of ways into this particular text of doing philosophy, right? So if I'm right that the argument is that philosophy allows us to actually serve the gods, to take that gift of whatever, the Neoplatonists call it being part of a saira, a chain of particular deities, right? Where, perhaps I'm in the Artemis line. And so I've got to figure out, how it is that I am like Artemis in my own unique way. Socrates figures out how he serves Apollo in his own unique way. And then once you do that, you can start, all right, what other parts of me, what other higher aspects of Artemis must I, put into my particular life. And so that here the diversity of principles and divine means that each person, when they actually respect and love the otherness, the messiness of the person in front of them, they're serving the divine by seeing the divine plurality, right? The divine, is both a one and a many. That nobody in this particular room is gonna have like it is a unique way in, right? They're in mirroring or likening, and it's diverse, it's plural, it's embodied in something that we have to wrestle with, and we're all going to do that in a unique way, and so that it, whether or not there's a plurality of gods that differ, they come into tension, right? And we
Yeah,
have to learn
right.
how to deal with that tension in ourselves and in our relationships, and that's a serving of the divine.
So I hear what you're saying. So if you see that your leader god is Artemis, say, and let's just say, for example, and you find ways of entering into the depth of that as you recognize it in yourself, and then you run into somebody like Gareth, and he said he's not embodying Artemis, okay, and he's coming across and coming through really differently from me, but in your putting it into the Greek pantheon, you might see him as say of a Hermes type or somebody like that. You just say, all right, what sort of a Hermes guy is he?
Mm-hmm.
And how can I respect the Hermes in him? I mean, and this is sort of like finding the other and realizing that sometimes Hermes might rub you the wrong way because he might make fun of you or he might,
Mm-hmm.
see something different in the way that you express yourself. So that's sort of a psychological way of understanding the diversity of the gods, as opposed to say, and I don't know if I need to go into this as opposed to, but if a more monotheistic sort of way of imagining our relationship to the divine, it could um, almost seem to shut down the diversity of otherness and recognizing the legitimacy of having an other view.
Mm-hmm.
So that if I'm really in a monotheistic sort of mindset, or if I'm really even stuck in my own sort of Neoplatonic mindset and thinking my leader god, say Zeus, is fucking right, and things have to go the way Zeus wants it to go. If you disagree with me, I'll tend to think, oh, what's wrong with you? Instead of recognizing that, of course, she's different. Of course, she has a different point of view because that's Artemis and she's got her own way of doing things. I think that's healthier, psychologically speaking. Um, and so it's really a question of how do we wrestle with the authority of our own, of getting into the depth of our own leader God and recognizing the legitimacy of somebody else's
Mm-hmm.
uh, deity and
Is
how it
that God?
works.
Is that God real, Greg, or is it a good story to help us reflect our psychological reality? I suppose
Well,
because I
dude,
kind
are
of
you
see.
real? I mean, what's real? I mean, it's sort of like, is that God real? God, I don't know. I mean, uh, uh, I'd have to say there's no way of answering that question. It depends on what you mean by what's real. Is that God
Okay,
real?
well, I mean, if we put it in kind of scholastic terms and reason to God by the nature of there having to be something purely actual, because we are actual and potential, but there has to be some cause which is purely actual, for instance. So that's a reality. I guess I think we love to do another episode on some of this stuff because clearly I think there's a lot of things I probably disagree with you about as regards the kind of, sorry, Danny, you want to?
No, I just want to say, look, what I
That's
love
good.
about,
It's good.
yeah,
Yeah.
Yeah,
like
yeah, no, sorry, I thought you wanted to
it's a
come in there.
great question, because like the same question, can the monotheistic God be, because I thought this is where you were going to go. First off, is the monotheistic God real? Or I thought you were going to say, is the conception of the Christian God actually as dogmatic as it's sometimes painted to be? Just like I think Greg was hinting at the fact, look, the pagan hippy dippy mystic can be just as dogmatic and scary and tyrannical. Like one of the reasons why I get turned off in some pagan communities is this like tyrannical, this is what your zodiac says, and this is what, and so then I was evangelicized by the astrologer or the palmist or all of these people who know, right? And one of the things that I love about the Euthyphro is it's showing, look, no, you can be polytheistic and still question what the gods love. That's part of showing that you love the gods. And I think Christianity has this conception. Kierkegaard said, like the highest form of faith is on your knees in doubt, right? The doubting Thomas, right? The questioner, the one that says, "Oh God, I do not know what you are, but I devote myself to you," right? And that I've always thought, look, yes, the Christian who betrays Christianity through dogmatism is just as big a problem as the mystic or the pagan that betrays paganism through dogmatism. And so,
Mm, but there was a point too that I think Gareth wanted to raise about how do we know that the God is real?
mhm.
And that's sort of it's a different type of question and maybe for a whole different kind of discussion.
Mhm.
But I think it's a good question um, because I think that at a
Yeah,
certain
well,
level we all struggle
we-
with that.
yeah, yeah, and like one question around that, for instance, could be something like, even if our belief in the God is misplaced and there isn't such a God, is it still better that we think that? And in the case of whether it's the gods or the Christian I am, or it's the pantheon of pagan gods, if our behavior or our morality is directed towards the idea that they're real, is that still better than them? Does it matter to whether they exist or not? Uh, as opposed to us not directing our life towards anything like that at all, and so
But just
existing in a
being
kind of
willing to question whether they're real, right? Like my husband tells me about how he was kind of converted to a philosophical conception of his faith, because like he doubted this kind of anthropomorphic father Santa Claus God, right? That he kind of just been given in
yeah, which is, I think, a very narrow conception of,
mhm.
yeah,
And so
but
when
it's a
you
popular one.
yeah, but most people can't sustain their faith on the basis of how easy it is to contradict that conception. And so,
Mhm.
the proper religious devotee or pious person, regardless of how they identify with their faith, is one who is willing to question their faith to make it deeper and stronger, to do what Proclus did and write a Platonic theology because there's so many questions that he needed to answer, versus, Meister Eckhart or Thomas Aquinas, that all of philosophical thinking about the divine, if it's so to speak inspired by the gifts of the divine, will do that work of asking, is my conception of the gods real?
And
Yeah.
you kind of the starting point is probably not,
Yeah,
you
I
know,
hope not.
right, probably not. And it's because, who's conceiving? It's, me with all of the, but that's the first step, and
Mhm.
it's kind of exciting. What kind of blows my mind, and maybe you could help me understand this, since you teach this regularly, Danny. When Socrates encounters this guy Euthyphro at the court, and Euthyphro says, "Yeah, I'm going to prosecute my dad," and he tells him why. Um, my inclination would be, fine, dude. And I just walk away, because I would think this guy's so out of his freaking mind that he thinks that for some reason that's pious. But yet maybe Socrates is so concerned about this guy Miletus, who thinks what he's doing is pious. So here's this guy who thinks he's doing something that's pious, that's so obviously not pious. Let me ask how these idiots conceive of piety, because this one idiot wants to prosecute me for being impious. And here's a guy who wants to prosecute his dad for doing something unholy, and neither one of them have a clue. Maybe that's why he's willing to engage him, but my God.
Hmm.
I it's funny, like ever since I was doing my dissertation, I've always had a different image in my head of Socrates than the status quo. Status quo has always been this like annoying, sophistic, you know, sophistic in the sense of, using bad analogies and false dilemmas, and so they get really irritated with the fact that the so-called paradigm of philosophy is this kind of jerk, right? Particularly feminist, right? And I never like it was funny. I could see why people saw that, but I always saw that impish man who knows how to tease and joke, and that everybody just, I think my uncle, this big, good old boy kind of guy who could walk into a room and everybody was just, wants to be around him because he knew how to spin an argument in a way that it always revealed people's characters and his own at the same time. And that's what I see is more of this impish kind of, and so that he stops with Euthyphro because it's fun. Philosophy isn't just a duty or a service that we do begrudgingly, but like I enjoy doing this, right? I enjoy being contradicted and contradicting, and in order for us to all be doing the things that we're good at, right? And so, and that's what I tend to remind myself is that the standard image of Socrates might not be real.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, it's interesting that I suppose, you know, on an important point, I suppose, about society and tolerance and these kinds of ideas, and how we engage with one another when we disagree, whether that's, religiously or politically and so on. And clearly, for whatever reason, whoever's wanting to prosecute Socrates here is a pretty intolerant kind of person and doesn't want to, brook any dissent in terms of the kinds of ideas that he's using to corrupt others and purportedly and so on. So uh yeah, we yeah, discover through these kind of conversations ways to agree to disagree or, come to different conclusions about things and so forth. And it seems a rather trivial thing to say, but at the same time, I think, it's an important thing.
But yeah, that's the thing is that what I love about Euthyphro, this text, I mean, is we got all these trivial definitions of what is pious that have been emptied because society has made them empty, right? Agree to disagree. Oh, that's just a trivial thing, right? Versus like, or piety is service to the gods or asking and giving. Like these are all empty things in a certain kind of culture that doesn't think about what those things mean. To agree to disagree has so much metaphysical, ontological weight. It makes the one many and the many one. It makes community and possibility alive again. And it doesn't mean that I'm going to ignore the bad in your statement. Like if we agree to disagree, it means you're also agreeing to be questioned again and to be refuted again, which Euthyphro just isn't. He runs off because he's annoyed
Yeah,
by the process. And so,
it's
Mm.
true. I
Um,
wonder if that's a, oh, sorry, Greg. I was going to say, I wonder if
no,
this
that's okay.
might be a point for us to kind of work towards a conclusion
yeah.
or to wrap
So
up
maybe we
today.
should
But
agree to
if you had something else to
disagree.
say, Greg, by all means.
So yeah,
I didn't mean to cut you off there, Greg, if you had something
No,
else
no,
to
it's
say.
okay. I was going to ask, I mean, in terms of this being rational, what was it that Nietzsche felt about Socrates? That Socrates was, didn't he have a critique of Socrates's rationality as corrupting the spirit of the soul of Western culture? And it's too, so there's something there in Socrates' rationality that rubbed some people the wrong way. And too much rationality does have a kind of corrosive quality, I think, too. But that's maybe for another session that we could
I,
talk about.
I agree. So just
Yeah,
to wrap up, but
that's a good one. Yeah.
because too much rationality, I think, is also a kind of dogmatism, and so that's where I think the key is that people who are really rational, how can you be rational and still committed to the irrational, to its underbelly, to its other side, or to what it can become, right? So for Nietzsche, rationality is just a step along the way to overcoming, right? Something, and I would argue the same goes for a Platonist, is that reason is part of the ladder of love, of journeying to the vision of the beautiful, and the symposium. But we have
I mean, yeah,
transgressed
I
the
mean,
borders of our time. So,
yeah, I would make one final point there, Danny, if I could. I mean, I think that could lead us into some really interesting territory around to what extent a certain kind of rationalism, we could say, might have led us into some of the kind of strange technological mess we're in some ways, in terms of a certain kind of understanding of what intelligence is and so on, and how that's led to a particular approach to machines and so on. I've been reading a really interesting book um, by Edward Fazer recently on some of these themes on a kind of scholastic approach to thinking about artificial intelligence and these kind of questions. And um, some of his thought interested me a lot around how he approaches questions like some of them we've been talking about today. So that I think could make for a very rich discussion at some point for us to tackle
What's the
some
name of
of
the
the
author that you mentioned, Gareth?
Edward Feser, Feser. He's
Feser.
yeah, he's published a book recently called Immortal Souls, but he's got a really good section dealing with
Okay.
yeah, a kind of Thomistic approach to looking at questions in artificial intelligence and so on.
Well, how about
Yeah.
this for next week, guys? Before I turn off the recording,
Mm.
since
Yeah.
we talked about this relationship between reason and the irrational, as well as ritual today, maybe next time we can share, something from the Platonic tradition related to those three themes, this marriage or this more than the reason, and how it might actually make ritual slash prayer, all of these things actually rational activities, or uber rational or over rational, or how it is that we can, all three of us, deal with that particular problem, whether it be within a monotheistic or polytheistic faith.
So reason, the irrational, and ritual, and possibly leading to an uber rational kind
Yeah,
of.
something beyond the contemplative.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well,
Okay.
and I guess our overarching theme of mystery as well, I suppose,
Yeah.
connects to all of
Right.
those
Right.
things. Yeah.